I'm going to continue our part of our message with a poem from A Book of Americans by Rosemary and Stephen Vincent Benet. Of Jonathan Chapman, two things are known: that he loved apples, that he walked alone. At 70 odd, he was gnarled as could be, but ruddy and sound as a good apple tree. For 50 years over of harvest and dew, he planted his apples where no apples grew. The winds of the prairie might blow through his rags, but he carried his seeds in the best deerskin bags. From old Ashtabula to frontier Fort Wayne, he planted and pruned and he planted again. He had not a hat to encumber his head. He wore a tin pan on his white hair instead. He nested with owls and with bear cub and possum, and knew all his orchards, root, tendril, and blossom. A fine old man as ripe as a pippin, his heart still light and his step still skippin'. The stalking Indian, the beast in its lair, did no hurt while he was there, for they could tell, as wild things can, that Jonathan Chapman was God's own man. Why did he do it? We do not know. He wished that apples might root and grow. He has no statue, he has no tomb, he has his apple trees still in bloom. Consider, think well upon the marvelous story of Appleseed John. A number of legends and tales have grown up around the folk figure of Johnny Appleseed. There are those even today who are surprised to learn that Johnny Appleseed was a real-life person, John Chapman. It's easy to understand why this solitary figure, roaming the wilderness planting apple trees, could give rise to colorful tales of adventure and lore. As a gentle person, John Chapman loved people and animals alike and carried no weapons to harm them. Stories tell of him talking to the wild animals, who may have sensed his kind and gentle ways as they watched him working in his nurseries. It has been said that he could understand the language of the crows as they told the news of the forest animals. It was also said that when Johnny would sit by his campfire at night, wolves would come near but never threaten him. Once it was reported that Johnny was caught in a snowstorm and crept into a hollow fallen tree for shelter. He found it occupied by a hibernating bear and her cubs, but spent the night there nonetheless. There is no report, however, of how much space he kept between them and himself. Johnny made friends with the Native American tribes, and he was known to have learned many Indian languages. Due to his ways with growing things and his understanding of plants that could heal, he was even considered to be a powerful medicine man. The Native Americans held Johnny in high regard because he had an unusual zeal for being useful and serving others, which led them to believe he was touched by the Great Spirit. Stories likely based on fact, but doubtless embellished through the years, tell of his role in averting clashes and bloodshed between the natives and the settlers. Johnny Appleseed liked a good tall tale himself, and his stories to the children of the families he visited were passed on for generations. One was about a boy who caught a fish so big that he had to carry it over his shoulder with its tail dragging on the ground. As Johnny put it, he had a fish fry that lasted 3 days, and when it was done, he sold the bones to a keelboat skipper to use for oars. The legend of the man Johnny Appleseed grew from his gentle influence of kindness, usefulness, and caring spirit as he and his Appleseeds took root in the lives of all he met.
Haha, me again. Find the right paper so you don't have to do the back rub again. So my portion, although Margie covered it a little bit, is to tell that there was a real man whose name was John Chapman. Unlike some of our superheroes we learn about in Disney movies or teach about in school, Pecos Bill and Paul Bunyan, who may or may not have had root in real people, John Chapman definitely was a real person. He was born in Leominster, Massachusetts in 1774, right in the birth of this country. His father was a fighter in the Revolutionary War. And when he was 2 years old, his mother died in childbirth, and father went on to marry again and have 10 step-siblings. So it was a crowded house, and as was the practice of the time, as you got older and the house was crowded, you left. So Johnny and his brother left, and they traveled to the west for them, from Massachusetts into Pennsylvania, and found some cider presses where they saw that a lot of the seeds were just going to waste. They'd press them and have the cider and then throw the seeds away, and he didn't like to see stuff wasted, so he made a deal to get those seeds. And at the time, as Tom said, it was the starting of the Northwest Territories, and they had a rule that if you had a section of land, in order to keep it within the first 3 years, you must plant 50 apple trees or pear trees on that land. So Johnny was very bright and very entrepreneurial, that's a hard one, and thought to himself he could see a chance to make some money. So he went ahead into the wilderness with his pack with all his apple seeds, and he would plant seeds. Now, if you know much about apple trees, they don't really grow from seeds very well. They don't bear fruit. So he would plant them in nurseries in rows, and then he would come back, and he would hire somebody probably to take care of them, and he would come back and graft them and do what needed to be done. Apples back then were very different than the apples you see in front of us. They were more for preserving for the winter and making cider drink. I could use some right now. So when the pioneers came and they wanted to settle, oh man, you got to have these 50 apple trees. How are we going to get those? And then John would show up, and he happened to have 50 apple trees for a price, and they'd give him the money, he'd give them the apple trees and help them get them started and chat with the families. And so he just kept doing that as he went westward and westward. And then he would go back to Pennsylvania to the cider mills, start over again, and take his money, go back and buy some more writings of Swedenborg and take those around into the wilderness, where he would also share parts of the Bible and pages from Swedenborg and talk with people. They were hungry for information. They did not have Google. They did not have the televisions and all the stuff we get our information from. So a person outside of their family that came by was great, and they wanted to make him welcome. And so it worked out for everybody. It was a good visit. We are going to give you a little play in just a minute to kind of see what it might have been like for a family in the wilderness if John visited. Let's see. He got to know the natives, and he was friends. There's lots of stories, whether they're tall tales or not, how he ran through the night and saved villages, trying to work with the natives, but trying also to help the pioneers to be safe. And it was hard times. It was hard times for everybody. If you were the natives, it was hard because your land was being taken. If you were a pioneer trying to escape a rough life in the East, it was hard. So Johnny was a little bit of a friend to everyone and a helper in need. One of them said the natives called him the white man who had been touched by the Great Spirit. So something, even though maybe he didn't communicate with them completely, his spirit exuded, and he made a difference. You might even connect it to last week when he heard the call. What did he say? Here I am. And he went to the west and did what he needed to do. Johnny had some loves in life. He loved God and the neighbor. He loved planting trees. That was his passion. He loved peace. He loved nature. And this one, he loved a hot potato well salted on a cold evening in front of a warm fire. The little pleasures in life that we don't experience. And he loved to tell stories. So we're going to tell you a story with the help of the children. You're going to have to pretend you're in that kind of a modern theater setting where there's not a lot of costuming. There's a little. There's not a lot of props. There's not a curtain across. So for a minute, they're going to get in their place and get themselves ready. And then Margie will read you a story, and they are going to act it out. So, children, do as your grandmother says.
Is everybody ready? We have our final actor in place. Pay no attention to that tall girl behind the little boy. Okay. This is a visit from Johnny Appleseed. A long time ago, when forests covered the land and native people hunted for deer, there lived a pioneer family on a lonely farm west of the Appalachian Mountains, perhaps in Ohio or Indiana, or maybe even Michigan. There wasn't much food to eat, and the whole family had to work very hard, but still, they were proud to be pioneers. It was Nora's chore to carry water from the spring. She took little Jose with her to help teach him how to do this job. There they go, fetching the bucket to get the water. Nando, Nora and Jose's brother, came running down the path from the log cabin to join them. Come out farther. The natives will catch you if you stay in the woods, he said. I'm not afraid of natives, said Nora. I think natives are in there now. Nora laughed. That's just the wind in the trees, she said. Some leaves rustled in the forest. Suddenly, a tall, skinny man with a long black beard stepped out of the forest. Come way out. Good, stop. He was dressed in tattered clothes and he had a heavy sack, but no shoes. That's no native, said Nora. 'Tis too, said Nando. He's going to put us in that old sack and carry us away. Just then, their father came running toward the cabin to see what the commotion was all about. Why, it's John Chapman, he cried happily. Folks call him Johnny Appleseed. The men shook hands. Johnny Appleseed spied the children, and his eyes twinkled. Do you young'uns like apples, he asked. He held out 2. Nora remembered the cool, sweet taste of apples and rushed to take a bite. Look at it first, young lady, said Johnny. Hold it by the stem and behold a wonderful sight. See how round it is? Look at its color. See how the skin is tight and smooth? Now bite, he said. It will taste better for having been admired. It was the best apple Nora had ever tasted. Juice trickled back along her tongue. She took another bite and just enjoyed its wonderful taste. Nando had crept up behind Nora on tiptoes. He watched her chew the apple. Is it good? He whispered. I've never had an apple before. Johnny Appleseed held up the remaining apple. It is very beautiful and ripe, he said. He set it on a stump and went away to talk with their father. Nando stood in front of the stump with his hands tight behind his back. I won't eat it, he said. I will, said Nora, but before she could take it, Nando grabbed the apple off the stump. Maybe I'll just smell it to see if it's good, he said. Nando held up the apple and sniffed carefully. Smells good, he said. Are you sure Johnny Appleseed's not a native? I'm sure, said Nora. Well, maybe I'll just take a little bite then, said Nando. He took a taste. Then he smiled. Then he took another bite and another, and pretty soon that whole apple was going to be gone. He patted his stomach. Good, he said. Johnny Appleseed came back to look at the stump where he left the apple. Johnny just walked right over to that stump to look and see if the apple was still there. "Did you eat it?" he asked. Johnny just came around that side of the stump perfect. "Yes, sir," said Nando. "Then where are the apple seeds?" asked Johnny. "I didn't eat them," said Nando. "I threw them on the ground." Johnny Appleseed frowned. "You should never throw away apple seeds. They're useful for planting trees. Let's see if we can find them," he said. So they all got down on their hands and knees to look for seeds. Pretty soon, Nando spied a brown speck in the grass. It was a seed. Plink, he threw it into the pot. Then Nora shouted, she found one. Plink, into the pot. Plink, 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 the apple seeds began to drop into the pot. Finally, Johnny Appleseed straightened up and rubbed his skinny back. "We found all but one," he said, "but now it's time for supper." Their mother had made a special meal of roasted venison and potatoes. They all gathered in the cabin around the table, and Johnny Appleseed passed around an apple for each for dessert. And they were very careful to save the seeds this time. When dinner was finished, the father settled back and smiled. "I have good news," he said. "We're going to have an orchard. Mr. Appleseed will give us all the seeds we need to start our trees." "Now I have some news," said Johnny Appleseed. "Good news right fresh from heaven." He poked into his sack and brought out an old, tattered book. He had ripped out pages and left them with the pioneers. On later visits, he would retrieve these pages and leave new ones. Some were pages from the Bible, some were from the writings of a man named Emanuel Swedenborg. These pages will tell you many things you may want to know about heaven. "Tell us about heaven," asked Nora. "It's the Lord's kingdom," said Johnny. "All people who love the Lord go there to live after death." "Are there any natives there?" asked Nando. "There are good natives in heaven," said Johnny. "The Lord always lets good people live in heaven, but not those who wish to harm others." "Are there apple trees in heaven?" Johnny Appleseed threw up his hands in the air. "Everybody in heaven who wants apple trees can have them," he said. "The apples there are all big and round and red. They are the sweetest apples you ever tasted." "What about worms?" asked Nando. "Worms? Yes, sometimes when little boys and girls are naughty, then the Lord lets a few worms get into their apples. But as soon as they are good, the worms disappear." Nando looked sad. He was thinking about the lost seed which he'd carelessly thrown away. Johnny said, "Don't worry about the lost seed. The Lord knows you didn't mean to do any wrong. Perhaps a tree will grow there from that tiny seed." "Tell us more about heaven," said Nando. Johnny replied, "Tomorrow your pa can read you more from the pages." That night, as they all went to sleep, Nando had a dream. He dreamed that the little seed that they could not find really did take root. It grew and grew until finally it was a large apple tree. It had the sweetest apples of any tree that they ever planted because it was a special tree. And each year when Johnny Appleseed returned with more news fresh from heaven and more apple seeds, he took an apple off the favorite tree, admired it, sniffed it, and then ate it all up and said it was the best apple he had ever tasted. Take a bow.
So to finish up the part of the message, my part is to talk about the faith of Johnny. But before I do that, when we have our moment of meditation, we quite often do a video, and at the bottom there are credits for the people who have put that together, and one of the names at the bottom is the person who does them all, Gwendolyn Phillips. And Gwendolyn Phillips happens to be our neighbor, and she's here today. So Gwen, thank you very much for all those moments of meditation that we're able to use. She couldn't miss an opportunity to come and see all the children, and we're so glad to have Gwen and Ginny both here. Also, just a little side note as well, when Bob and Margie lived in Fort Wayne, there is a Johnny Appleseed Festival in Fort Wayne. And they always had a church service. And Bob and Margie would go to the Fort Wayne Festival and go to the church service, and they always talked about the writings of Swedenborg and Johnny's faith. And Bob and Margie went to the organizers and said, it just so happens that we know of that faith, and we'd be very happy to help participate in this worship service. So as time went on, Bob and Margie and BJ and I were the ones who were able to put that worship service together and did it every year for the Johnny Appleseed Festival. So we miss Bob today and being part of this process, but he has been part of us doing a Johnny Appleseed honor service for quite some time. So the faith of John Chapman, Johnny Appleseed. John's religion really was intertwined with his love of nature, as well as his reverence to the Lord, to the Bible, and to the writings of Emanuel Swedenborg. As we've heard, Johnny walked thousands of miles planting nurseries and orchards, selling his saplings and his apples. On his travels, he would share stories and leave pages, like Johnny did here today, of the Bible and Swedenborg's writings for the settlers to read. And as BJ said, he used the proceeds from those sales to buy more land to plant on and to create orchards and nurseries, and he used that money to purchase more of Swedenborg's books to disseminate to the people. I'd like to share with you 3 or 4 of Swedenborg's religious doctrines that Johnny would take with him as he traveled. And some of these thoughts may resonate with you, and some may be a bit contrary to your thoughts. Both are okay. Hopefully it will help you reflect on your journey with the Lord and learn a bit more about Johnny's journeys as well. Johnny shared that the Bible was the inspired word of God. And that's why Nora opens the Bible for us the last couple of Sundays. We believe that the Word needs to be open, and it's open to us as people to understand what it means to our life. There are 2 parallel stories within the pages of the Bible. One is the historical account of the people and the places and the events, and the other is a deeper inner meaning that is a spiritual reflection of our individual life journeys. And we touched on that a bit last week when we talked about the stories of Samuel, Eli, and Isaiah. And Johnny would say that those stories of the prophets are really about us, that they have an inner spiritual meaning that reflects upon our life today. The second doctrinal point that Johnny believed and would share with people is that we are all spirits clothed in human bodies. That when we die, our material bodies are set aside and we continue living our spiritual life just the same as we are right now. We move from this realm to the next as the same person that we were. And we live that according to the kind of life that we have chosen for ourselves here on earth. Johnny would not view heaven as a reward or hell as a punishment for our earthly lives' behavior. We choose whether we want to spend eternity in a heavenly state. We choose whether we want to spend eternity in a hellish state based upon the rules that have our loves that have ruled us during our life here. If we truly love the Lord and our neighbor here on earth, we will choose an eternal life of living with God. If we truly love hurting others and living a life of sin, then we will choose a similar hellish life in the next life. Because that's who we are, and that's what we want. A third point that Johnny would make that many church people may find a little bit controversial is you do not necessarily need to be a Christian to go to heaven. Those of us raised in the Christian tradition have been given a gift of learning of a loving Christ ever since our childhood. But there are millions of people before us, and millions of people now, and millions of people ahead of us who will grow up in a different faith family, or perhaps no faith family at all. And we can't imagine that a loving God would turn his back on these people and close the door to eternal life and joy forever because they didn't know. If they live their earthly life the best way that they know how, or that they are raised, loving their neighbor and being of use, they really are living in the Spirit of Christ's name, even if they don't know it. And they will seek that love in the next life as well. And Johnny's fourth and final point that he talked about is the doctrine of uses, being useful. And it relates to our ruling loves. What really drives us as a person? Our goal in life is to get in touch with our ruling love and to put it into useful service for the Lord in whatever we do. And so what is it that we love most, or we want to be? A teacher, a preacher, a plumber, a waitress, a retired grandpa, a mentor, an orchard grower, whatever it is. When we find it, we need to turn the greatest love that we have and offer it openly and joyfully to the world. Out of love, not obligation, but out of love. Do what you love and love what you do. A Johnny Appleseed right there. So, our message is, be a Johnny Appleseed and spread your fruitful love wherever your travels may take you, far and wide, young or old. Amen. Our offering today is